Hi, my name is Michael, and I want to talk about shareware. Shareware is a distribution method for software, including but not exclusive to video games, in which you receive a piece of a product, and then based on whether you like it or not, you can register that product and get the full thing. This was done back in the 80s and 90s especially. There's still shareware, but back in the 80s and 90s, that was definitely the heyday, I think, of the shareware method, where companies would send out in large shareware disks filled to the brim on CD-ROMs, which people suddenly had to fill 700 megabytes, which they thought was huge back then, with stuff, with games, with programs, with everything you could imagine. And they would send out these shareware disks in all kinds of places. You can buy them on their own, but more often you got shareware disks from gaming or electronics magazines back in the day. And they would just be filled to the brim with all kinds of amazing things. And they're a major part of my nostalgic love for gaming. You see, you had to be born in a certain era and experience gaming in a certain way to realize the thrill of getting a brand new shareware disc that said thousands of games on it, and realizing that you held in your hand the portal to countless hours of adventure. What you had to do with the shareware disc was sift through it. It was like finding a diamond in the rough. The fun of the shareware discs was that you were able to spend hours and hours looking through all of the junk that you didn't like to find the treasure inside. And that was the main fun of it, not just finding eventually the software that you liked, but spending all of this time just sifting. It was like trying to pan for gold in a river. And I remember just spending, entire nights during the summer when I was a kid, just right after dinner all the way up until midnight or beyond, just looking through these discs for something that was good. And you could find all kinds of stuff in these discs. Really almost anything that could potentially be on a computer could be on here. Now, the covers usually made it seem like there were hundreds or eventually thousands and thousands of games on the disc, but that was really not accurate. When they said game, they really meant file. There were thousands of files to find on the disk, not all of them games. Some of them were merely collections of fonts, for instance. That was a big thing back then, which I find a little mysterious. I mean, did they include only 2 fonts, like Times New Roman and Helvetica, and that was it back in the day? And, you needed to go to third-party sources to get thousands of fonts? I mean, I guess so. There were some of them that had huge numbers of text files, weirdly enough. And I remember going through them and finding just pages after pages of jokes in one of these shareware discs, and they were terrible jokes, but it was just so silly to find them there. There was one I found that actually included an entire RPG system just made by some guy out there. It was his interpretation of a Dungeons and Dragons style RPG system, and there was like 100 pages of this stuff, of races and classes and his method of performing fights. So it was amazing, and I kick myself to this day to not have that. I wish I had this random guy's interpretation of D&D that he spent so long writing out. I wish I still had that to this day to read it. It was actually pretty fascinating. And that was one of the great things about the shareware discs. You could find things that just random people made, that you could find virtually nowhere else. It was just some guy in his house making a game. And most of the time they had a kind of computer programming class project kind of feel to it. It may have sort of been a functional game, but it was made not to appeal to people so much as it was to prove that this guy could do it, or just to have fun, or just to practice with a programming language. But sometimes these random nobodies could make amazing games. One guy could theoretically program an entire game himself that you could spend hours and hours on, and it was amazing to find it. There would be some short demos of major games like Doom or Wolfenstein 3D, but the shareware model included some games that were, very large. There would be a third of the entire game, like Crystal Caves or Secret Agent by Apogee, where you would get 1 episode out of a 3-episode series. So you get a third of the entire game. And that was amazing to find that there. And there was, of course, freeware thrown in there, some things that were just completely, that had no copyright at all attached to it, that the people that were making the disc realized they could just act as aggregators of this stuff and just shove it on there and say, hey, you get this free game here. It's amazing. Try it out. And if the game was 5 or 10 years old, sometimes it would be completely free, and you could just play it and, have a great time with this old-fashioned game like Cave Story or something like that. I don't remember if that was freeware, but something like that. That was, a full game, a well-made game, but it was totally free and just packaged on this disc. I got this in the mid-90s. You see, when we got our first computer, I think it was in late 93, like Christmas of 1993. And within 3 or 4 years, we'd got another computer. And this old one, our original one, was handed down to me. I got to play with it after that. It was my computer. And instead of being just an old piece of junk, I loved this thing because I would especially love exploring the shareware games and especially DOS titles. Now, I was a little bit too young to really mess around with DOS that much, but I still ended up exploring it and playing with it in the mid to late 90s when DOS had finally sort of given way to Windows at that point. And learning about it in the games with it, that was just a great experience, learning about this era of gaming through shareware discs. And there are some excellent games on there. There are games that pop up on a bunch of different shareware discs, and you recognize them, like Castle of the Winds, which was a Windows 3.1 game, or ZZT, which was sort of a software for making games. And you could find full games on there that were amazing. And yes, there were also whereas on there, that is pirated games that people cracked and put on there. It was always kind of neat to experience, to discover that, to find this sort of like hidden illicit stuff that shouldn't be on there, and see the people that had cracked it. And admittedly, most of the files on the shareware discs were pretty junky. They were boring. They were not very interesting. They were always people begging you to register them, and if you registered them, that is, if you sent money to the people that made the shareware, they would send you the full copy. And some of them begged a little bit too much. They called it nagware, because they were always, like, begging and begging you to buy it when maybe you didn't really want to do that. It was a really interesting system where people could theoretically make a game on their own and distribute it essentially on their own, and then get money for it from people that tried it out on the shareware discs. It's been killing me over the past, 10 years, because we had one of the best shareware discs that I loved, and spent time and time and time again, years as a kid, messing around with the shareware disc and reading things on it and getting things off of it and playing games. And I can't for the life of me remember the name of it. I just don't remember the name at all. I've been racking my brain for over a decade. I just don't know, and we got rid of the disc ages and ages ago, of course, so I have no recollection whatsoever what this is, and there are so many of these shareware discs, just the ones that are on places like archive.org, there are just hundreds and hundreds of them, that I can't find the one that I'm looking for. And that just, it just breaks my heart that I can't rekindle the exact thing from my childhood, but I can rekindle some of the stuff from back then. Actually playing the shareware discs these days is a little bit tricky. If you have a Windows 64-bit computer, that means you can't emulate a 16-bit software system like these old shareware discs tended to be. If you have a 32-bit system, you can, it's fine. But if you have a 64-bit, and most people do nowadays, you can't really use it. You're going to get an annoying little screen pop up that tells you that you can't do it. There is a way, however, to play them, but it's very complicated and irritating, and no, I don't really have the resources or the time to go out and get an old classic PC. I don't have the space to even store it in, really. But there is a way to use the old CDs or the ISOs of the old CDs, but that requires a kind of difficult process of emulating an operating system using something like VM virtualware, which allows you to emulate Windows 95 or Windows XP or something like that. And it kind of takes a lot of memory, and it takes a lot of space, and it's a little confusing if you're not tech literate, which I'm not. But I was able to figure it out and use it, and I think it's great that I could actually go back, even in this complicated way, and figure out how to use these old discs. And yeah, that's really all I wanted to say. Please tell me if you've ever had the same experience I did. I get the feeling that I've seen some people on YouTube kind of get into these shareware discs, but please let me know in the comments if you have had experience with these shareware packages of thousands of games, as they allege, and just the simple nostalgic joy of remembering going back through them and exploring old Windows 3.1 games and DOS games. What do you think of these games? Do you think there's still something worth going back to? Do you think I'm crazy for liking these weird things and having this powerful nostalgic drive for going back to this rather odd bit of software distribution from the mid-90s that hasn't been popular in over 20 years? Please let me know what you think of all this, of these old games, of the old DOS games, of the shareware world in general. It just reminds me of the old days, of the pre-Internet 2.0 days where suddenly everybody and your grandma is online. It was an older time where you kind of had to have a little bit of tech knowledge, some experience in using computers to get the games to work. And yeah, I just have this real love, this real memory for those days. So please like this video if you liked it. My name is Michael, and please subscribe if you want to see more videos, more content about video games, movies, and television shows. And yeah, thank you very much and have a good night. And play Castle of the Winds. That's a great game.